So welcome. I'm going to be talking today about media and information literacy for healthy communication ecosystems. And that word communication is in brackets for a reason, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about the intersection between healthy communication ecosystems or media ecosystems, and then implications for the ecosystem in terms of nature, biodiversity, climate change, and so on. So that word ecosystem sits at the kind of intersection between the work I've been doing for quite a long time now in media and information literacy and the work of the Science, Health and Data Communication Centre. So this is very much about intersecting and interdisciplinary ways of working going forward. Much of today's presentation will be about a theory of change for media and information literacy, which has been developed over 10 years of research and is now being applied specifically to these contexts with regard to misinformation in health and science environments, and also the increasing need for data literacies. This slide is just to indicate to you the body of underpinning research that's been there. So as you can see, there are projects there funded by the British Council, UK government, BBC Media Action, AHRC, US Embassy, European Commission, Samsung. So we have work with government, charities, research funders, and also the kind of technical sector as well in the form of Samsung. And the theory of change that we are now using for media and information literacy has been developed, across the body of work for over a decade, as you can see on the screen. So I want to say that just so there's no sense of, sitting down with a piece of paper and kind of constructing these ideas, and then using these ideas to evaluate the research field without having conducted a varied body of research ourselves. When I say ourselves, I'm talking about colleagues in Bournemouth University and other projects I've been involved in collaboratively. Don't have time to mention everybody's name during the presentation, but I'll be using we as a collective term, obviously, for the fact that this is often collaborative research. So setting the scene, if you do media and information literacy research, as I do, quite a lot of the time now, we're in demand, but there can be some kind of problems and tensions around being in demand in this way. And we're in demand because, of course, the situation in terms of the health of the communication environment has got so toxic and so bad that there's a kind of pervading solutionism. And of course, if you're somebody who does funded research, then there are benefits to that, because you're seen as being somebody who can be a researcher for kind of positive interventions in a kind of crisis moment. But of course, it's always much more complicated than that. And so you're always in that kind of tension as an academic working in this space. But to set up this notion of solutionism, the quote on the screen there is from Douglas Rushkoff. And his work I admire. He did a really good project called Team Human, and he's written many books, and he's a very kind of prominent keynote speaker in this field. And he talks in this quote here about this notion of kind of resilience, and he uses the metaphor of, kind of antibodies and making the patient more resilient to the disease. So, of course, during COVID, this way of thinking about misinformation and the infodemic, and, there was a kind of analogy, wasn't there, between the need for vaccines to protect us from the virus and also the need for a kind of resilience inoculation to protect us from particularly health misinformation. But I also have on the screen there Richard Hoggart's book from 1957, The Uses of Literacy, which he wrote in Hunslet, just outside Leeds, Yorkshire in the north of England. And he was writing then in 1957 about how, as literacy develops and more people can access literacy of whatever kind, then clearly there are huge benefits to the individual and to society. I've never heard anybody argue for less literacy, right? So people can be socially mobile, they can access new forms of education, there's new opportunities for civic engagement, all of the things that we associate with the development and increase of literacy. But at the same time, people then become an audience for people who want to sell, an audience for people who want to persuade, and potentially an audience for people who want to manipulate. And so, of course, when we think about media and information literacy, we're still in that same kind of duality all these years on, even though we're now thinking about AI and we're thinking about deepfakes, and Richard Hoggart was thinking about magazines and television. I would argue that that same complexity is in place, which is why the other book on the screen there, Algorithms of Resistance, which is part of a series of contributions in recent years to kind of mining back and reclaiming spaces around AI in particular, is also there to suggest that it's, I agree with Rushkoff's point, but it's also more complicated than that. So the work we've done in Bournemouth University and other spaces over the last decade is really about media and information literacy in complex ecosystems. So as we can see from the slide, our research tells us that people have different levels of media and information literacy within these diverse and complex media ecosystems. It's very rarely the case that the participants you're working with or a society or a community have the same levels of literacy, of course. But these ecosystems can be made healthier, just as the natural environment can be made healthier. And I think one of the problems we have with the kind of solutionist rhetoric is there's an acceptance of the problem as though what we need to do is just become more resilient to it in that kind of neoliberal citizen responsibility discourse. Whereas when we think about climate change and the natural environment, we don't just accept it, most of us. We believe that there's education needed, but also there's change needed in terms of how human beings interact with the environment. And then what we can do is to help people to develop capabilities to use their media and information literacies in ways which can have positive consequences. And we'll come back to that relationship between capability and consequences quite a lot during this talk. And the theory of change we've developed is to help us move beyond solutionism. So we think more about what media literacy or media and information literacy is for, which is why the book on the screen now is there, because this is a book that I was involved in writing with Pete Bennett and John Potter, where we actually went back to Hoggart's work and used the same frames of references for the kind of media literacy landscape, trying to address that same complexity and duality that I spoke to earlier. But since it's Wednesday afternoon and half term, and people don't want to just listen to me in my East West Midlands fused accent, I'm going to just share with you now an exercise that I do quite often when I'm working in a media and information literacy project, whether it's with teachers or students or participants. And I just want us to reflect as we watch these two videos on how we would bring our own media and information literacies to these two video clips.
This is what happens when direct action prompts a public reaction. Anger erupted after a rush hour train was held up for more than 10 minutes. Neither station staff nor the police intervened.
You come to work in your car. Imagine someone needs to go to hospital or something.
With other Extinction Rebellion members gluing themselves to trains, commuters couldn't understand why public transport had become the latest target.
They're doing it the wrong way. They're doing it for the right reasons, but they're doing it the wrong way.
No one should do that anyway, regardless of what it is. That's just out of order and it's not right. They could have killed themselves anyway.
I think they've really shot themselves in the foot, to be fair. A lot of people getting public transport as opposed to getting their own transport.
You guys, I'm so sorry.
Altogether, 3 trains were halted by rooftop protests.
People at the station aren't very happy here. You can see
A cameraman who was streaming live pictures of the protest also became a target as passengers lost patience.
A man in a red jacket was punching in the face a woman who was a commuter, also disrupted, who was calling on him to stop his violence. And that was the most shocking moment of the morning for me.
Altogether, 8 people were arrested, among them the Reverend Sue Parfitt, an Anglican priest.
By contrast, this Extinction Rebellion event at Gatwick Airport is being tolerated by both airport officials and the police, because although they're handing out leaflets, they're not disrupting any passengers' journeys.
They said Extinction Rebellion as a whole had voted against halting trains. The group acknowledged it had been divisive.
I'm not condoning the action. XR will not condone that action. But I know what's in their heart and why they were motivated to do it. And I feel a little sorry for them because they got themselves...
You feel sorry for the passengers as well, then?
Oh, of course I do. As I said, if I was on that train, any of these disruptions, yeah, I would be angry.
But the reality is that if all protests looked like this, they wouldn't get any media attention. As we near the end of a second week of XR demonstrations, only the most disruptive action generates headlines. And that risks alienating the very people they're trying to win over. Ian Woods, Sky News.
They're not doing anything to avert climate catastrophe. And that's why I'm here.
To me, the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to run the unrightable wrong, to love and chase from afar. To reach the unreachable star. This is my quest to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for our holy cause.
We're not powerless at all. We're very powerful. And in fact, those in power know that we're very powerful. That's why they try to separate us.
But like peaceful and cold when I'm late.
The International Energy Agency has said fossil fuel investment must stop now.
The world will be better for this. That one man is gone, covered with scars, still strong with his last ounce of courage.
In a world in which we are being driven towards the very edge of the cliff, to love is to resist.
The unreachable star.
Now, if we had time today, what I'd like to do now is pause and get everybody's kind of views and reactions on this. But I hope you can see it's pretty obvious, and none of you need me to kind of teach you about these two videos. But it immediately complicates any notion of things being kind of true or false, or things being misinformation or accurate, and resilience being about fact checking and verification, because you cannot react to these two videos, I don't believe, without your own not bias, but your kind of emotional and informed situatedness around the subject matter, but also your own reactions to the construction of images and persuasive images in media. So of course, one is a conventional news broadcast, and we could use classic theories around kind of news agenda setting, selection construction, narrative flow, etc. And the other uses video to create something more apparently emotive. But the point is that you cannot respond to these two videos neutrally, or without situating yourself in the kind of complexity of both the natural ecosystem and your position in the media and communication ecosystem, and of course your relationship with capitalism, because the news agenda is entirely about that kind of Mark Fisher idea that it's harder to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism because people have to commute and so on and so forth. One exercise to do with students or participants in this space is to have two groups and you show the videos a different way around, because it makes a huge difference. If you see the XR video before you see the news video, it makes a big difference often to how people respond. So these are there just to set up, again, that intersection between media and information literacy as something much more complex and relational and emotive, and of course the subject matter of the videos being climate change and media and communication around climate change as well. So I'm already using quite a lot this word ecosystem, and when I moved into the SHDC group and we got talking about this new research cluster, there was quite a lot of conversation about the word ecosystem, because I recognise, of course, that it has a particular meaning for my field, as I've described quite a lot, but a very different meaning in the kind of science, health, comms world want to hold on to the use of the word in those related but different ways. I think that's really, very important. One of the prominent writers on media ecosystems is Antonio Lopez, who has presented himself to this speaker series twice actually over the years. And you can see that he uses this way of thinking to think about the relationship to the media environment and its members. And his book is on the screen there. But I've also done some work myself with colleague Karen Fowler-Watt around media misinformation, where we use the ecosystem framing for quite a lot of that work. And more recently, Nick Coldry, only last week actually, has published his book, co-authored book on data grab about new colonialism and how kind of extractivist imperatives work in that space as well. It also uses this notion of an ecosystem, that we are all in this ecosystem, and our data, they argue, is the kind of equivalent to land being kind of territorially extracted, resources being extracted. So the ecosystem metaphor or framework, depending on how you want to use it, has quite a lot of persons in the field at the moment, but it also, of course, has a much more direct environmental series of implications, as this video will illustrate.
Hey, you. Yes, you. Are you aware of the impact your smartphone has on humans and the planet? Your phone is made of glass, plastic, and minerals like tungsten, tin, tantalum, and gold, which are mined in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These are known as conflict minerals because the fight to get them causes warfare and environmental destruction. Your phone's battery is powered by lithium, a mineral found mainly in South America. Extracting it harms the environment, and the fight to control it causes violence, such as the US-backed coup in Bolivia in 2019. These extracted materials are then shipped to places like China, where overworked and underpaid workers manufacture our devices. These sweatshop conditions led Foxconn, the world's largest manufacturing company, to install nets on their factory dorms in China to prevent the rise in employee suicide. Before packaging your phone, chemicals are used to remove all traces of human touch and toil. The factories where our gadgets are made pollute the local environment with toxic chemicals and waste. Your phone's data does not actually live up in the clouds, but rather in server farms, which are massive networks of computer servers stored in buildings around the world. These depend on huge amounts of power and water to function, emitting as much carbon dioxide as the airline industry. The EMF radiation that our phones emit has been linked to cancer in humans and has a negative impact on the health and behavior of birds and insects. Your phone is designed to only last 2 to 3 years, after which it either gets thrown out or shipped to countries like Ghana. People subject themselves to toxic conditions to extract the precious metals to sell. So what can we do about this? First, we can learn and raise awareness about these issues. We also need to put pressure on lawmakers and companies to ban conflict minerals and produce more ethical products like the Fairphone. Ultimately, we need to move beyond our current linear economic system of take, make, and dispose.
Okay, so I'm using this material just to set the scene right now. I don't think we need to probably are very much aware of these issues already. Just to say, since I'm chairing myself, I noticed there's a question in the chat already. I'm going to keep my eye on that, but I'll come back to questions at the end of the talk. But please continue to post them in the chat if you'd like me to respond to them later. So the final slide on the kind of scene setting for moving to our theory of change work is this one from a recent work by Catherine Fry, which I really like as well in terms of dynamic media environments, expanding the scope of media literacy. So we have this notion of a kind of meteorological media literacy. So maybe I've overemphasized it, but I'm trying to set up right from the outset the notion of these intersecting and overlapping ideas about ecosystems in the world of media literacy, and also, of course, in the world of science, health, and data communications. So we arrive at this theory of change for media literacy. I use the terms media literacy and media information literacy interchangeably. The focus for us today is on MIL, media information literacy, but it depends on where the funding is and what the call is, whether it's described as one or the other. So this theory of change for media literacy has 4 interrelated elements. It's very important to say they're not linear, they are interrelated, but consequences, which is on the bottom right of the screen, is difficult to arrive at without the other 3. So access, capabilities, and awareness are interchangeable, interrelatable, but consequences tends to be the accumulation of change in the other three elements. I will come back to these quite often throughout the 15 minutes or so to go. The first project where the term theory of change was directly used was with BBC Media Action. BBC Media Action commissioned me to produce with them a theory of change communications framework toolkit and training program for digital media literacy with regard to two particular strategic objectives for the charity. One is tackling information disorder, and the second, supporting healthy media ecosystems. And Media Action work in over 20 of the most kind of fragile, challenged, kind of precarious societies, you know, often without democracy or with a very kind of vulnerable democracy. So when you do work in these spaces, it's there's a kind of shared idea with the funder, in this case Media Action, of what the problem is and what the solution is and what digital media literacy will do. But in producing the theory of change, there was a very kind of healthy dialogue between us and the BBC Media Action about the complexity of this again. So we were able to kind of do a deep dive into their work and actually show them that it wasn't a one size fits all, and that some projects they were doing in some countries were getting them more into the kind of access change space. And then other projects in other countries were getting them more toward the kind of positive consequences element. So a lot of this work is about saying media and information literacy won't solve your problem in and of itself, but there are elements of change that a particular project might be able to deliver or develop latent potential to deliver, depending on the actions and intentionality of the participants later. Because one thing about media and information literacy projects is they're really hard to demonstrate impact on longitudinally or at scale, because the funding is often quite short-lived, and you're actually asking for people to change their relationships with media and communication for the long term. So unless you have millions of pounds and you can track them for 10 years, it's much more difficult. So a lot of the evidence we produce in projects is kind of intentionality, people stating their intentions to change behaviours rather than anything you can kind of empirically demonstrate. More recently, we've worked with the UK government departments now called DCIT. It was DCMS when we did this work in collaboration with Ofcom, in some work which was part of the media literacy strategy, which is also part of the online harms bill, which has just recently gone through Parliament. I won't dwell on the tensions and issues around this project, you can imagine, but the intention was to provide for the UK government a robust evaluation framework for all projects funded by and all projects actually beyond the UK government work in the UK media literacy space that would be consistent, because for years there's been a consensus amongst the media literacy kind of policy facing work in the UK that there's a lack of a robust evaluation framework. So that's what we were commissioned to develop. Ofcom were doing some similar work at the same time, so we collaborated with them, and the resources I'll show you later, they link to the Ofcom site and vice versa as well. But of course, as soon as I mention Ofcom, you know, you'll be aware this is a regulator. So you have that kind of protectionist, I would argue, neoliberal citizen resilience discourse already, as opposed to something perhaps more agentive and activist that we'll come to later as well. And also working with the Media and Information Literacy Alliance, which is now a registered charity, bringing together academics, teachers, journalists, information professionals, librarians, BBC, NHS. So it's a really kind of vibrant, multi-partner, multi-agency alliance that I'm involved in. I'm currently the chair, but to charity trustees, and whether we have a chair going forward or not, we'll decide in a couple of weeks. But I currently am. And that work has brought our research into direct collaboration with the NHS. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. But on the right-hand side, you see an article from the Lancet about managing medical misinformation. So where we've come to now with the work is informed by these alliances and dialogues as well between the media and information literacy world and such organisations as the NHS. So I'm going to talk you through what the theory of change consists of. So first, at the level of access, the crucial thing to say is the third bullet point is the one that isn't always apparent, that we restrict our own access to parts of the ecosystem. So we think about access as being, do we have the technology? Do we live in a democracy? Do we have a plural media system? Do we have an education system that allows us to access media and information from an informed perspective? But of course, we hugely restrict our own access by making particular choices about what we read, what we watch, who we follow. So a lot of the work we do is about raising awareness of our own agency in terms of access. I would just argue that awareness is the one I need to explain the least to anyone in this call, because it's the kind of meat and drink of media communication and cultural studies. But at the broader level, it's about your understanding of how your media environment is constructed. So what is the ecosystem you have access to? How is it configured? As well as being about particular kind of text and information level work. Moving into capability, we use SEN's work as the kind of primary influence, and SEN did a lot of work in kind of healthcare as well. And so it's about that kind of interplay of human functionings and resources leading to capabilities. And this went all the way back to the project we did with Samsung, which was, wow, when I first went to Bournemouth, so over a decade ago now. And we were working with families and a school on the island of Portland, and looking at this way of using technology plus education to kind of enhance domestic capabilities, actually, or cross-family intergenerational capabilities. But what's very important, so this is about how you use going back to Hoggart really, how you use your literacy in your life to access services, to be part of a kind of civic environment for all kinds of things, education, of course. But the crucial thing at the bottom of the slide is the one really distinctive element of our theory of change, which we can fairly confidently say we were not the first to say, but the first to kind of operationalize in this way, which is recognizing that lots of people, in fact, probably the majority of people who are in power, do not use media information literacy for positive consequences. And it has been in this kind of solutionist space, a kind of strange assumption, in my view, that literacy is the answer, whereas really the uses of literacy for social justice, for equality, diversity, inclusion, advocacy is the solution. And that's often lacking, but very hard to demonstrate in a project, of course. So the consequences, there's a subtle difference between capability, but really it's about positive change on what we call a functioning civic society. We initially used the word democracy, but when we started working with Media Action and British Council, we changed that because it's now a very loaded term and actually quite a problematic term in many environments. So functioning civic society has less of a kind of loaded quality to it, we found. And if we look at the coloured font, this is about being more critical with information and media content, and a change of mindset in more resilient users. And this does include your relationship with science, health, and data, of course. How we have used this and how we have made the resources available open access is that there's a kind of walkthrough, which I'll show you next. But we have not only those 4 elements, but we have change objectives, and then we have impact measures. So you can look at a project, media and information literacy project, or you can design a project using this methodology to understand better or kind of locate better where you think you can deliver latent change or manifest change, or elements of both. On the website for the project, we have this walkthrough, which is narrated by Karen Fowler-Watt, my colleague. And I'm just going to show you some of this now to give you a flavour of it.
Hi, so this is a walkthrough of how to use the Kemp theory of change for media literacy projects or activities. The idea of this theory of change is that we can think more precisely about what we want a media literacy project to change for people, or we can use it to evaluate the kinds of changes media literacy activities brought about for the people involved. We have produced it so it works in combination with the Ofcom Media Literacy Toolkit. So here we will show you how to use these 2 resources together. On both websites, you can find underpinning research that informs this approach, and a whole library of projects and research into media literacy, So these are really useful for understanding what work has already been done, where media literacy is going, and how the field is developing. Once you're ready to either design or evaluate a project, then go to the Ofcom toolkit to learn how to design a project and how theories of change are useful for media literacy. Then you come back to the resource, and firstly, you can use the 4-element descriptors to identify which aspect of media literacy the intended change will relate to. Is it to do with people's access to media? Is it about their media awareness? Is it intending to help people to use media literacy to develop their capabilities in their lives? Does it want to make a positive difference to society through the consequences arising from people's enhanced media literacy? Often, a media literacy project will create change in more than one of these areas. So it's not about only identifying which one element is relevant, but looking across the elements to see where change can happen. This framework is also flexible, so we can identify change, see the potential for change, and also include both manifest and latent change. When you have identified the change elements which the media literacy project or activity can achieve, then move to the change objectives table and identify which of the specific change impacts can also be evidenced, or where the potential for change is apparent. For example, new kinds of knowledge developed by people taking part in the activities, or people doing things differently in their lives, and how these changes are related to their access, awareness, capability, or the consequences of their media literacy. You can use this resource to evaluate a project at any stage. This could be a new project, identifying the change it's likely to achieve once you get started. It could be a midpoint review of a project, or it can be a final evaluation of the change a media literacy project created. This section helps you to reflect on the change objectives for each element of the theory of change in relation to knowledge, skills, competences, dialogue, attitudes, and norms and behaviour. Access. Awareness.
Okay, I'm going to pause. You can watch that in your own time if you want to. It just walks you through the rest of the process. I hope you can see that the resources for people to either evaluate a project, design a project, or both. But it's about that kind of more nuanced, kind of complex, and in some ways more kind of realistic and measurable way of designing a project that wants to make a difference to participants. MIL, I mean literacy. Going further outside of the scope of the UK government, that video was produced for the UK government and Ofcom work, but outside of the scope of that, we've also used the theory of change to identify transferable design principles. So we're interested also in not just how a project's designed in terms of what it delivers, but the relational aspect of the people. And often if you're working with British Council, you might be working across 3 countries. And for example, I've just completed a project in Ghana and I'll be going back in a few weeks to do some more work there. And one of the things that's very important in a project like that is the relationship, which is often kind of political and tense, often between, you know, representatives of the British Council team, home visitors who go into kind of family spaces and work with people in the country, Wikimedia, who are a partner in the project, who have certain expectations about, obviously, things like web access and so on. And some of the more impactful projects are those when the relationships between partners are very carefully kind of protected and looked after and very agile. So the link on the bottom of the screen there is to a web comic we produced that actually has 10 transferable design principles for projects, which we found to be best practice with regard to the elements of this theory of change. And one key finding was this notion of third space, which we've been interested in for a long time, but kind of found validated in this work. So often, you know, media information literacy intervention will work best if you learn from your participants, from their first space expertise with media and communication, and you bring to that from your second space vantage point a kind of critical reflexive framework, and there's a genuine knowledge exchange between researchers, practitioners, trainers, and participants or students, whoever it may be you're working with in this kind of semi-porous membrane third space that exists, not just in between the two spaces, but flowing back as well between them. And an article which I'll share the link with you later in the journal Media and Communication, we wrote about mapping the kind of change to the space in the way you can see on the screen. That diagram actually kind of uses color coding to map the theory of change elements to these kind of first, second, and third space configurations. So, what does all this mean for working in the Science, Health and Data Communication Centre and thinking more about that intersection again? So the two elements really, one is media and information literacy for promoting societal resilience to misinformation per se, more broadly, and then how does that support better health, science and data literacies? And what I decided to do to conclude this talk is to map our theory of change to all of the talks that have taken place in this speaker series for the last 3 years. And so I've done that as follows. So if you look at the Eventbrite space, you can see there's been a huge amount of talks convened by the centre in this series. It started kind of during the COVID times when, you know, Anna Fagenbaum, who kind of led on this, was incredibly active in bringing together, you know, fantastic people to speak, and some of those fantastic people are in this call. I'm very flattered to say today. So I've been looking back at all of the talks conducted in the series over the following years. What I've done is I've mapped them across to this theory of change and the elements of the theory of change objectives that I've quickly described today. Now, this is not a robust research exercise. This is me looking at abstracts and having been in quite a lot of the talks from memory, looking back over notes. Of course, if I did this as a proper research exercise, really using the theory of change, I would have a more robust, systematic approach to how I did that. But if we try to break them down into the three categories, although they are always interrelated, and you can see on the screen now lots of the research shared in the series around health literacy mapped to the theory of change in particular ways. So I'm just going to draw on a few as we go through. So a talk a few weeks ago by Arceli Documentary about shrinkage and active affordances and how people with disabilities create more habitable worlds for themselves, often using digital media as a way of kind of organising that way of living, actually, which also has a counter-representational kind of changing the story discourse around that as well. You can see on the screen I've mapped that across to our theory of change in terms of counter-representation, adaptive capability, diverse and pluralist media ecosystem awareness, and those kinds of aspects as well. Also in the space of health literacy, there were more health literacies than others, but I think that's probably because the first year was all about COVID. We were living through a pandemic, right? So you're going to have more focus on health literacies perhaps than the others, although I am going to keep saying they are interrelatable. So when we have here Emma Weitkamp exploring cartoon representations of the CV coronavirus pandemic, so it's very much about kind of critical awareness of how the pandemic was being represented in a particular visual medium, but also there was a kind of advocacy element, which was also shared with Anna Fagenbaum's work on the previous screen, around kind of the efficacy of the comic medium for actually helping people to navigate, you know, the ontological kind of crisis of a pandemic in real time as well. So it's not only awareness, but also kind of positive ecosystem intervention there as well. And more recently, Andrea Wilhena, who presented a few weeks ago, she's doing work on kind of the art of presence and encouraging people to reflect on the way in which they connect digitally or not. So it's not a kind of tune out project, it's different from that. It's about reinstating in people a sense of presence around digital technology as well. And that then leads to these kind of notions of more mindful decision making. So that's at the other end of the spectrum for kind of health literacy. That's about your own health, your own relationship with digital technology, and being more reflexive on that as a kind of well-being intervention, I suppose. Moving to science literacies, Antonio Lopez, I mentioned earlier, shared, I think he's spoken twice at the series, shared his work on fake climate news, but also that kind of intersects with algorithm literacy as well. And then we move into work by co-director of the Centre, Arne Goyne, on Global South's over-reliance on Global North science news. But in that work, Arne doesn't only observe that tension, but also makes recommendations for how newsrooms might behave differently in the Global South in order to kind of work through this these problems in different ways. So there's always a kind of relationship between awareness and capability. And of course, with something like that, you couldn't claim that Arne's research, as effectively a content analysis, delivers consequences. But with this theory of change, you can say that there is latent potential, because if Arne's works and its recommendations are then implemented, you will have positive consequences later. So latent potential is a very important part of all this. At the bottom of the screen, I'm really interested in this. I'm chairing this talk next week by Catherine Munro, but I don't know yet because I haven't heard it. But I think it's going to be about notions of kind of nature and space and domestication related to kind of environmental science, but I haven't been able to map it because I haven't heard the talk. And then finally, in the space of data literacies, very important what I've said there at the bottom right, the disclaimer, it's almost impossible to distinguish the data literacies work from the other elements I found by doing this. I don't want to make it appear that these are distinct. But Sarah Jones spoke to us about, the need for kind of AI literacies. Fabo Shakuri talked about building AR tools for the real world. But then also Brendan Lawson's work on the kind of life of COVID-19 in numbers isn't just about saying this is the data, but it's about how can understanding how the data makes visible certain inequalities lead to different kind of diversity expectations around the media and information ecosystem. So again, always that link between raising awareness through your research, but then a kind of advocacy and capability intervention as well. So all of which is to say, before I conclude, that the relationship between media and information literacy and health and science communication and people's ability to respond positively to health and science communication is, I think, clearly pertinent now. And this also converges with the need for all of us to develop, increasingly urgent forms of data literacy as AI becomes, more and more incredibly powerful. But there's always that relationship between being aware of the way that the media, information and data ecosystem is configured and the imperative to do something to change it through positive consequences, just as there is that imperative around climate change awareness and climate change action for positive consequences.